Today we're listening to Bach's The Art of the Fugue, specifically Contrapunctus 2. And the main thing that I want to sort of draw out of this particular selection is the mathematical precision of the music here. Where we've looked on the one hand at the very religious sort of motivation behind music, with Martin Luther's hymnody, and with the Gregorian chants before it through the medieval period. And we've also looked at sort of like the popular music, like with Henry VIII's Pastime with Good Company, the sort of light-hearted, let's just sing a song and have a good time attitude. Increasingly, throughout the 17th and 18th century, these two sort of forms are sort of colliding into one another. And as there's an increased sort of focus on a secular power structure outside of the religious power structure, you will see more and more money funneling into music that is meant to sound powerful and awesome and in keeping with the spirit of the scientific revolution. Bach represents this perfectly. In The Art of the Fugue, he will play with the same themes, the same melodies, the same harmonies, but he will constantly manipulate them. So this is just the second of something like 4 or 5 movements, all of which radically manipulate the same basic musical themes, the same basic musical progressions and structure. So over the course of this Art of the Fugue, he will play the same theme, but he will play it backwards, and he'll play it like disconnected from one another. He'll play it over itself, and it will all have this beautiful musical harmony to it, this sort of calculated precision and like very deterministic perfection. And this is very much in keeping with the spirit of this moment in history. If I can call it a moment in history, because today we're covering something like 200 years of European history, and there's a lot to cover. So once again, we're probably going to go long. I apologize for that in advance, but here goes. So the first thing we need to talk about is the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike last time where we sort of talked about the Renaissance as it affected all of Europe simultaneously, we're going to talk about Europe piecemeal this time. Look at it country by country, because each nation is starting to develop its own identity, and those nations are going to very much come into conflict and sort of be the major players on our general humanities stage for the next several weeks. And the one that doesn't belong is the Holy Roman Empire. Like we talked about it a little bit last time, how it's a bit anachronistic, that it is still this sort of loosely unified group of various principalities. And you can see, like, there are just hundreds of duchies and little counties and confederations, and all of them have their own leadership, all of them have their own interests, and they are always fighting one another. You can see that Austria-Hungary is a big deal. The Habsburgs are running a lot of the Holy Roman Empire at this point, and you can see Bohemia over here is a big deal. You'll also see right up here in Poland there's this little Prussia thing, which is going to become a whole lot more important to German history in the next few hundred years. But the Holy Roman Empire is a mess. It was a good idea back in the medieval world where these sorts of feudal structures made a lot of sense and were sort of the case all over Europe. But they are very much an anachronism now as England and France and Spain are gradually coming to unify one another. But what's worse is during that whole Protestant Reformation business, we mentioned him briefly and he showed up and he gave us a cameo in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. But Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, also is the Habsburg inheritor. And as a consequence, he comes to rule like 60% of Europe at this moment in history. He ends up inheriting Spain and all of southern Italy, controlled by the Spanish. He ends up inheriting all of the Habsburg holdings, so everything that is Austria and Hungary over to the Ottoman Empire. He also inherits a good bit of Scandinavia, though it's not on this map, in addition to being the Holy Roman Emperor and therefore, running the show in what we know now as Germany. But because he controls so much of Europe, he's also an enormous threat, and he will spend the entirety of his career fighting with France, fighting with England, fighting with the Russians in the East. Like, he is absolutely going to be this major threat to the European world. And as a consequence, it's just going to explode from there. All those wars that we talked about after the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War specifically, happens in the late 16th, early 17th century as largely a response to how powerful, how suddenly powerful Charles V was. Like, Charles V very much represented the march of Protestantism. He was very happy to, fly those Protestant flags and get himself out from under the Catholic power structure, although it very much backfired at the end of the day, and he had to give a lot of territory and a lot of his inheritances. After Charles V's death, he's separated those empires again. So now it's a different person running the Habsburg holdings, it's a different person that's Holy Roman Emperor, and it's a different person running the Spanish Empire. But also, all of that 30 Years' War took place on Holy Roman Empire soil, just further sort of damning them in the European world. They are completely powerless. Their resources have been destroyed. They will suffer famine and poverty for decades to come. Now more than ever, the Holy Roman Empire is weakened and really sad looking. A major part of the problem here is that the infrastructure is now gone. Like, the confederation that used to hold them together very much has been scattered, especially because so many people have jumped ship and joined the Protestants, just as a whole bunch of, holdouts in the Holy Roman Empire have stuck with the Catholics. Plus, the Holy Roman Empire was always designed to operate under sort of not Catholic supervision. There was a fairly delicate balance between the emperor and the pope, but with Catholic aid at the very least. And now that Catholicism has sort of been written out of the Holy Roman Empire in a lot of places, it's really hard to say exactly how this weird conglomeration of peoples is going to work anymore. They've just been, rolling snake eyes after snake eyes in history for the last several hundred years, and it's very much going to show. The 17th and 18th centuries, the period that we're talking about here, is going to be a time of consolidation of power in many, many states. It's going to be a time of radical change, and the Holy Roman Empire is just not going to be able to keep up. When Germany is in fact unified, like in the next lecture or couple of lectures, they will have this enormous disadvantage. They will see that, all of the industrialized powers like England, like France, like the United States, they've been, doing technological advances for hundreds of years at this point, and Germany can only just now start to do that. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. By contrast, let's look at the sort of world that is, in fact, coming together. Let's look at the Spanish and the rest of the sort of Catholicdom as our start. And let's look at their particular art movement at this point, namely the florid Baroque. So one of the things that is going to very much unite Europe in this period, and it is almost unprecedented that all of Europe is going to be on the same page artistically for most of this period of time. Like, even during the Renaissance, the Dutch were doing their own thing, and the English showed up to the party late. As much as I talked about it as one movement, it very much started in Italy and spread its way out, sort of picking up speed as it went along. The Baroque, on the other hand, very much hits all of Europe altogether, and while it does vary a little bit from one place to another, a lot of the same priorities and a lot of the same sort of artistic interests are evident in each of the sort of incarnations of the Baroque. Now, the florid Baroque is what you will most typically find in Catholic Europe. So you will find it among the Spanish, you will find it in what's left of the Holy Roman Empire, especially the Catholic parts of the Holy Roman Empire. You will find it in certain bits of Italy and France. France less so. We'll talk about France momentarily. But the important thing about the florid Baroque is that it is super ornate. It is absolutely still rooted in all of that, aristocratic nobility and bearing. It has all of that money celebrating the old power structures of Europe, including and especially the Catholic Church and all of its sort of majorly influenced territory. So just like we talked about, like the burial of Count Orgaz in the last PowerPoint lecture and how it was super Catholic, you can see here it is also still super Catholic in the florid Baroque. So over here on the left, you can see the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Once again, it's focusing on a saint, not one of the big major biblical figures that the Protestants also agree are awesome, but rather on one of the specifically Catholic figures. But also notice how different it is from a lot of the Renaissance and Mannerist art we've seen so far. Note how there's a variety of different materials being used here. Like you've got these big copper pipes doing the sort of like rays from heaven. You've got the marble work on the actual statues. You've got this, wooden arrow with the metal tip. Like whoever the sculptor is in this case is very willing to use a variety of different techniques, a variety of different media to achieve what they're willing to accomplish. What's more, because they're willing to do that, the effect is overwhelmingly lavish. And you'll see that the florid Baroque very much takes the assumptions of the Renaissance and sort of adds money to it. Like, where the Renaissance was all about simplicity and sort of getting back to the ancient Greek and ancient Roman ideals of, like, Spartan virtue and simplistic artistic depiction, the florid Baroque is very interested in, let's do those realistic human figures, let's do those, fairly easily lit, like, landscapes and stuff, but instead, let's just make them busy and complicated, and let's ritz them up with fancy materials, and let's make them exciting and active. You'll notice, like we talked about with mannerism sort of getting more exciting, getting more active, you'll notice that the Ecstasy of St. Teresa is one of those depictions that is in the moment. Like the angel's about to stab her with the arrow. Her love for God is about to be realized. Now, notice, like this is something that can only happen in an instant. They are between two moments. It is the transformation that is being depicted here. This is one of the constants of the Baroque movement. You will see over and over and over again where the Renaissance was sort of like, let's draw a painting and let's have it, represent this eternal truth, this thing that is always true or that is always being repeated. Let's show the characters in these sort of easy, languid poses to make it seem effortless and eternal. The Baroque will constantly look to depict that moment, that instant between one thing and another, an instant that is unrecoverable, although it is frozen in stone or frozen on canvas. You can see that in the allegory of the missionary work of the Jesuits here, and once again, super Catholic that we're celebrating the Jesuits here. Notice, too, the opulence, the decadence of this. This is a giant ceiling panel, like the ones that we talked about in the Sistine Chapel. But where Michelangelo was just interested in depicting the stories of Genesis, notice that this actually makes the ceiling look like it extends into infinity. Like there is no ceiling on the building. You can see it going up and up and up and up, using that fancy linear perspective, but in a very new way here, to the point that it all focuses on the central figure, and surprise, it's God. Like, you can see all of the angels are busily moving in here, and you can see all these figures standing on clouds and like climbing off climbing off the ceiling here, holding onto the pillars that are supposedly reaching up to the sky. You can see those barrel vault things like we would see with the Renaissance, but now it's all busy. Now it's all crowded. Now there are all these figures around doing stuff. And again, in that moment, in that transitional moment, they're all active. They're all doing things. They're all gesturing, or they're all trying to like mess with one another. There's just so much happening here. And at the same time, it sort of all focuses on the wealth, the richness, the awesomeness of this whole building. It very much makes it seem more than it is, very much in keeping with that sort of ornateness. Now, on the other side of the florid Baroque, you'll also see a lot of creativity coming down the pike. Because there's a lot of money, because these are old power structures, because this is relatively stable, or at least they're pretending that they're relatively stable, whether or not that bears out will be fairly evident in the next 150 years or so. There's also a fair amount of room for sort of artistic experimentation. And perhaps one of the most famous examples of artistic experimentation in this time is Las Meninas by Velázquez. Now, you might not think that this is terribly, impressive, and you certainly won't recognize it as, having a lot of the characteristics of the other florid Baroque things that we've looked at. Like, not a whole lot of super Catholic on display, no angels, no, supernatural figures, no ornate detail, no, rich materials being used. You can see that there is like a moment here, like you can see especially this character and this character back in the who's like climbing up the stairs. They are both in that sort of frozen, stuck in the moment pose. But a lot of the other, the daughters here, they're just kind of hanging out. Like this, she seems perfectly at ease, and she's mostly at ease. The dog is pretty chill at any rate. This could sort of hover between the like Renaissance and Baroque emphases on art. If it wasn't for the fact that it's like dark and that the chiaroscuro is very prevalent, which makes it very clearly either Mannerist or Baroque. But you'll note that this is actually a portrait. Like we've seen lots of portraits before. We've seen lots of artists depicting like the one person for posterity or whatever. And this is no exception. It's just a very different take on the portrait. So you'll notice that all of these figures, these are not actually the people who the portrait is for. According to legend, Velázquez went to the King of Spain, and the King of Spain was like, I want you to do a portrait for me. And Velázquez was like, okay, so we have two options here. Either I can just, give you a portrait, like that's the easiest thing in the world. We'll just have you sit for it and I'll paint you and it'll be fine. Or I could do something nuts and you will always be remembered as a consequence. And the king, of course, is like, yeah, that sounds good, let's do that. So notice, this is Velázquez. This is his canvas. This is a portrait not of the King and Queen of Spain. This is a portrait from the perspective of the King and Queen of Spain as they are sitting for the portrait. This is their perspective. We, the viewer, are taking the role of the King and Queen. We are looking at their daughters and their handmaidens and all of their court figures as they're sitting around, like, watching them be painted by Velázquez. Unless you think that I'm, like, crazy and doing, the English professor thing where I'm reading too deeply into something, you can see that Velázquez has also drawn a mirror here in the back. And here they are, the King and the Queen of Spain. You can see them reflected in the mirror in the far back. And you'll notice that it's even a little bit illuminated, like Velázquez wants to draw attention to it. This is wild. The fact that Velázquez has the tenacity, the temerity to depict not the king and queen as objects, but the king and queen as subjects, that's new. And we will see a lot of sort of riffs on this idea much later once we get to like Impressionism and once we get to a lot of the modern art movements. This is some of the earliest experimentation with exactly what side of the canvas we're on, exactly how the business of doing art affects the business of art. Velázquez is doing some pretty interesting groundbreaking stuff here, and he's sort of carrying the King and Queen of Spain along with him on this. Portraiture is a long and storied tradition. We're going to see a lot of portraits over the course of the next, hour or so, because a lot of these monarchs are going to want themselves featured for all history, for all posterity. You will never see another one quite like this, though. Velázquez is doing some really cool stuff insofar as he is painting the act of painting itself. Hooray! It's metatextual, even back in the 17th century. But let's keep on moving, because I could probably talk about Las Meninas for quite a while. Let's talk about France. So you all watched the creepy black and white video. I imagine that you hated it. That's fine. I love the crap out of it though, because it is so creepy. Like when the narrator guy is talking about how, King Louis XIV is the absolute monarch of ruler, and he's technically keeping all of his aristocracy hostage, and like he's so happy about it, and like the happy 50s music is playing, like it's no big deal. It's so weird to me, and I love it. Like, it's so creepy and uncomfortable, and it's such a just, discordant note. Um, That's what I want to drive home here, though. King Louis XIV was ruling in France for the better part of the 17th century. Like, he took the throne as a kid, in theory, under the protection of Cardinal Richelieu, who is like the villain of every single story about this time, because he very frequently is perceived as like manipulating the French throne through his, patronage of Louis XIV. And then Louis XIV, like, frequently, well, as soon as he comes of age, he like kicks out Cardinal Richelieu and has him executed. It's kind of a bad time for Richelieu. Um, but what I want to stress is that Louis XIV sort of creates the nobility around himself here. As the video suggests, this is the age of the absolute monarch, and Louis XIV is the quintessential example. He famously said at one point, "I am the state," implying that like everything that is France is invested in his person. Um, and he's coming at this from a fairly philosophical background. The idea of absolute monarchy has obviously been around since like ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and ancient Greece. The theory being that, the king or the emperor or the pharaoh was actually a god on earth. The pharaohs held that they were gods, that they, would, when they died, join the pantheon of Egyptian gods, and you could pray to them just like anyone else. It should absolutely build monuments to them just like anyone else. The Romans are a little trixier. The emperors would become gods when they died, according to like Augustus's tradition. Although numerous emperors like jumped the gun and insisted they were gods in their own time. Like, I think, was that Caligula? Oh, darn it, Caligula. Quite a few of the Roman emperors got a little big for their britches, and it was very important by the latter part of the Roman Empire that the emperors would be worshipped as gods, to the point that they would like execute people who didn't do that. Looking at you, Christians. In the 17th and 16th century, though, there is increasingly a move by all of these monarchs, who are now in some ways liberated from the Catholic Church by the Protestant Reformation sweeping through and making things a lot more tense. But also, they are willing to say, "I am God's representative on earth." This was always kind of the assumption through the medieval period, that like God had put kings in power and therefore you should obey kings because God wanted you to. But increasingly, the nobles are sort of arrogating that to themselves. They're saying, "I am God's lieutenant. I am, the rightful ruler by divine decree. I am the state," in Louis XIV's case. And this sort of renewed power structure can frequently, be good insofar as it unites and sort of strengthens a state under a central figure. But it should definitely make us worry. Like, there are definitely tyrannical overtones here. Louis XIV was a very deft statesman. He changed the French court, and many European courts throughout Europe tried to match him. Most notably, Louis made everybody move. The capital of France, to this day, is Paris, and up until this point, the king and all of his court resided at Paris. But that was occasionally ripe for trouble, because a king situated at Paris could be manipulated in Paris. They could be, assassinated or controlled by sketchy cardinals. Louis basically said, "All right, well, I'm not going to get murdered or bumped off by some, rival noble. I am moving my court to my turf." So he bought this territory and he built this giant palace of Versailles, and he proceeded to, centralize the entire government around him. He was, in short, keeping everybody hostage. He forced everybody to come to him if they wanted to stay in his good graces. Power was now centralized wherever the hell Louis XIV wanted to centralize it, and nobody could do anything about that. In the process, he also very much realigned the power structures. As much as he calls himself, the representative of God, the lieutenant of God, and like James I says, he also very much kept the church under his thumb. The bishops and the cardinals and the priesthood were very much considered his subjects in his eyes. The Catholic Church had to petition him, not the other way around, and that's the way he wanted it. Again, by moving to Versailles, he changes the whole power structure there. He's not under the Paris parish. Now he will make his own dang parish, and he will make his own dang shots, and the priesthood can come and beg at his feet just like anybody else. Now, Versailles expanded significantly. Like, it's a huge territory. I've been there. It's awesome to look at. Like, it's gorgeous. Um, and it has, stayed relatively the same to this day. Like, you can see here is sort of like the basic plans, and you can see the gardens and the fountains going all the way back. This reverses the perspective, but this is a modern day helicopter shot. Like, you can see that they've expanded the wings on either side. This is, I believe, later 18th century stuff, possibly late 17th century stuff. Like, Versailles construction proceeded in like 3 different phases. But you can also see that like the city and the town have just grown up around it. Again, this was the center of France. All the aristocracy had to like pick up and move or get left in the dirt. And that meant spending all of their money, buying new territory from the king, filling the imperial coffers. This was a fairly brilliant move. It funded Louis's wars, even though they weren't terribly successful in the end. It funded Louis's programs. It funded Louis's own construction. So, you move the palace once, and you build just the basics that you need to survive, and then you get the aristocracy to pay the rest of the bill for you. It's pretty convenient. But also, this centralization of power meant that when Louis XIV died, everything fell apart. Not immediately, but we'll get to that. But again, this is very much a monument to the decadence, to the opulence, to the incredible wealth sort of arrogated to the king in this moment in history. All the fountains, all of the gardens, all of the fancy buildings. And even if you go inside, you can see that he's built these lavish halls. Like, this is the famous Hall of Mirrors. And mirrors were not cheap in 18th century France, or even 17th century France especially. But notice, the architecture that's on display here, it has a lot in common with the florid Baroque. It's got that same opulence. It's got that same focus on wealth. But where the florid Baroque is all about super Catholics, Louis doesn't care for that stuff so much. Remember, the Catholic Church is subservient to Louis XIV as far as he's concerned. So instead, you'll see in the classical Baroque, there's a lot of emphasis on these typically classical figures. So you've got these big fancy candle stands made out of bronze or something, and you can see they're very sort of ancient Greek or ancient Roman. They're still, ornate. They're still decadent in their own way, but the inspiration isn't religion, Christianity, the church, so much as ancient Greece and Rome, just like it was with the Renaissance. So notice this is kind of one of the major characteristics here, is that what was the Renaissance and Mannerist art movements are fracturing. The different sort of focal points of each one of them is now sort of separating into a different side of the Baroque. So on the one hand, you've got the ornate Baroque doing all the Mannerist busyness stuff. On the other hand, you have the classical Baroque, which again, you can see the poses are not natural. The characters are all, in these positions that would normally be uncomfortable. The musculature is there, but you can see that it's not contrapposto for the most part. Instead, they're unbalanced. They're holding them up, and it's about to fall over. These don't look sturdy if you take a close look at them. But at the same time, they are classical. They have this pagan mythic quality to them. Now you'll also notice that the classical Baroque is kind of like a toned down version of the florid Baroque. You can see that again, the simplicity is here, but the practicality is here as well. The great thing about the Hall of Mirrors is that at a certain time of day, right around sunset, I want to say, the light from the windows will actually bounce off the mirrors. You can see the light from the windows stretching out over the floor here. The lower the sun gets, the more it extends outward. outward until it actually bounces off the mirrors and fills the room with light. And of course, that's when Louis would have all of his major parties and stuff to show off exactly how wealthy he was. Now, in some sense, it's ridiculous. Like, it took so much freaking money just to keep this place heated. And there are stories of, like, Louis XIV eating dinner at these massive, long tables with nobody else there, and he's, like, covered in coats because there were literally not enough fireplaces in the world to heat this giant, like, drafty room that he built. So it definitely, is more show than substance, but that show was really effective, and everybody in Europe wanted a Versailles at the end of the day. Now, the last example of the classical Baroque that I want to show us, just as sort of like, because they did art too, not just architecture, here is Landscape with Orpheus and Eurydice by Poussin. And here is another classic 17th century French artists sort of doing their classical Baroque thing. But notice what the subject and how it's depicted actually works here. So, like we talked about, the classical Baroque is all about these mythic, these pagan figures, and here we have one of the greatest myths in all of history, Orpheus and Eurydice, the story of Orpheus who, his wife died tragically at their wedding, and he had to descend into the underworld to get her back, and ultimately failed tragically. Here we see the actual wedding. So here we have, Orpheus is playing his lyre, and we've got Eurydice over here, and look at how shocked she is. It looks like there's a snake. Oh no! This is literally the moment when Eurydice is tragically bitten by the snake, when she tragically dies. This is the horror, this, again, moment caught between, one state of being, the happiness that Orpheus and Eurydice had, or were expecting as husband and wife, and then the horrible journey that Orpheus has to take that ultimately leads him to despair and sort of death in his own right. And you can notice that, like, all around us we see that same Baroque focus on activity. It's a lot less, like, ornate, a lot less complicated than we saw with the florid Baroque. But you can also see, there's emphasis, there's sort of like this symbolic echo of the tragedy that is about to take place in this fortress that is apparently burning for some reason, unexplained in the context of this painting. So again, you can see a lot of the traits that we would see from the Renaissance and the sort of like mythic subject matter and the flat lighting and the sort of contemporary hills and all the qualities that would normally lead us to think of like the French or even the Italian or Greek countryside. But also these elements of chiaroscuro, the sort of darkness and surrounding Orpheus and Eurydice, the ominous destruction on the horizon, and the actual poses of the characters, especially Eurydice, who is in this moment about to be bitten. So that's the classical Baroque, as I want to talk about it. Now I want to focus on something radically different. As Louis XIV is consolidating power into the French nation and sort of turning it into his own playground, his own sort of, like micromanaged miniature empire, the Dutch are actually making empire in a very different way. The Dutch don't have a centralized power structure. Like, they do, but it's an oligarchy. Like, it's really weird. It's a bunch of merchants and rich folks, like rich secular folks, who just sort of agree to run the government together. There's no king, there's no, bloodline inheritance thing, except insofar as, like, the sons inherit the father's wealth and then inherit the father's position on said board. But the Dutch are leveraging their power and money into trade. The Dutch are building the first ever trade empire. This is definitely the predecessor to what will be like the East India Company for the British in the years to come. They absolutely start to get holdings over the New World, so they find New Amsterdam, which, is New York City. They create sort of trade pockets over in South America and indeed in Brazil. Like, there's a huge population of the Portuguese and the Dutch, both of whom are sort of doing their empire building at this moment in history. The Dutch, very famously, are the first ones to sort of round the tip of Africa and make it over to the very rich areas of China and India and Indonesia and Japan. Like, there's a lot of money to be had here, and bringing all of those spices and bringing all of that wealth from the Far East back to Europe, where the need for it is rapidly increasing. If you can pull it off, there's a lot of money in it. And the Dutch do pull it off, and the Dutch make a lot of money. And this is new. Like, the idea that you can build a nation, that you can build an empire through trade alone. Like, the Italians had been doing that for a little while, sort of, but it was also very fractured. Like, the Italians are constantly fighting each other throughout the medieval period, throughout the Renaissance. Like, it's just constant. The Dutch, by having a unified, stable sort of people hanging out together, and by leveraging that stability into this trade prowess, make money hand over fist. And as we talked about last time when we were talking about the Reformation, the Dutch are very much influenced by that whole Calvinist philosophy where, you can be Christians and you can be rich. There's no contradiction there. And in fact, if you're rich, it probably means that God loves you even more. And the Dutch are totally all about this. Let us fill our bank accounts and let us show that God has blessed us. But as a consequence, the Dutch also very much pioneer this new side of the Baroque. Just as we talked about last time with the great Dutch masters focusing on all those peasants and all those secular themes, so the Dutch here are going to focus on secular reality. Remember, it's not kings, it's not popes who are commissioning the art in this case. Where all of those great Catholics' works were altarpieces commissioned by popes and bishops and priests to sort of like communicate Christian truths and sort of reinforce Catholic identity. Here, that's not the priority at all. Where King Louis XIV wanted to reestablish his sort of like authority by pointing to the Greeks and Romans, the Dutch don't care about any of that. The Dutch have money, and the Dutch have money because of just being people, totally apart from religion and monarchic structures and so on. As a consequence, the art that they make shows people. So this is perhaps one of the most famous works of the Dutch masters, The Night Watch by Rembrandt van Rijn. And this is just folks. Like, Rembrandt was asked to basically do a group portrait of this one random military company. Like, a bunch of dudes just, with their, like, muskets and spears and pikes and so on and so forth. And notice how Rembrandt is not interested in sort of representing them as this highfalutin, Napoleon on his horse, Washington crossing the Delaware. Like, he's not interested in idealizing them in any way. He just wants to portray them as people, just being people. And now he manages to do that same Baroque like specific thing where he's showing them all in a moment. So you've got like the one guy over here who's firing the gun and it sort of like melds with the feather here. You've got like the animal down here that's just like doing his thing. You got the guy beating the drum. You got people talking to each other. Like, this is a giant mess. Like, all these people are just not organized. Like, you kind of imagine the group work photo where the photographer is like, all right, everybody smile, and like 6 people are not paying attention and 3 others are talking to each other and one person's laughing and one person's doing the bunny ears. Like, there's just chaos, and it's absolute, like, completely unscripted chaos. And where your usual photographer is going to have to like wrestle with the group in order to get them to all face the same direction and look at the camera, notice that Rembrandt actually wants the chaos. That's exactly what he wants to depict here. You can see it, like all of the diagonals are going in all these crazy different directions. You can see like everybody's sort of doing their own thing. This guy's loading his musket. This guy's, doing something else. The 2 apparent leaders are just walking forward, gesturing. You can see that foreshortening, another very characteristic stylistic detail of the Baroque. That's what Rembrandt is interested in. That moment, that instant before all the organization or after all of the organization. This moment that can't exist beyond this instant. This moment of very natural, very sort of like secular, very sort of human life. Likewise, we can now, in the Netherlands, talk about sort of actual people stuff. Notice that this is Carousing Couple by Judith Leyster, who is one of the first and few female artists we're going to talk about in this class, I'm afraid. All the more reason to include her. But also notice that this is not, again, highfalutin royals or important people or rich people or anything like that. This is just peasants. Even more so than the Night Watch with all the like random soldiers milling around. You've just got like two random peasants carousing. And in case you don't know what carousing means, take a look at the context. You've got this strange liquid dispensing object in what is obviously a glass of something, and their cheeks are a little reddened. Yeah, they're drunk off their ass. Like, if it isn't obvious, they are absolutely drunk off their ass. And Leicester wants to depict that. People will buy this painting. There is a market for it now. There are people rich enough to celebrate the peasant world that they've frequently come from, that they've advanced from for one reason or another. This is just two people chilling out. She's definitely into this guy because presumably he can play the violin fairly well, even while intoxicated. But they're both drunk off their ass. They're having a good time, and that's good enough. That's material for art. It doesn't have to be big and important anymore. The Dutch are very interested in the small moments. Because, again, like, now that you've taken art out of the hands of the patrons informed by religion and sort of like bloodline power, you can start to celebrate and sort of admire things that are simple, things that are straightforward, things that anyone can do. Keep that in mind because we will be coming back to it. But of course, we have to talk about England as well. So, as much as like this is a crazy time for the French, and it's a crazy time for the Dutch, and it's a crazy time for the Spanish and the Germans and the Church, and oh my gosh, it is a crazy time for the English. So once upon a time, the House of Tudor was running the show, and the House of Tudor has been around for like 100 years at this point. And Elizabeth, she is freaking awesome. She is the famous patron of Shakespeare, and she very much keeps the Protestant and Catholic factions of England and Ireland and Scotland all in this like uneasy balance with one another with the sheer force of her personality. Like, she's a freaking juggernaut, and she totally controls everything in England for the duration of her life. But she doesn't have kids. And that means it's going to be nuts when she dies. So when she inevitably dies, it's not going to be, Elizabeth's daughter or son who just like randomly takes up the mantle. Instead, we got to jump back up the line to Mary Queen of Scots and her son, James I, who is already the King of Scotland. Oh shit. No British person wants the Scottish king to show up. Those damn Scots are all Catholics and we're all Anglicans, and we don't take any of that crap. And they're all panicking that James I is going to like institute Catholicism, and all these Protestants, especially the sort of like hardcore right-wing Protestants like the Puritans, are freaking out about possible religious persecution. And for good reason, because some of the stuff does come down the pike, and it is a freaking mess. Ironically, James I is also the guy who does the King James Bible, which is like the definitive English translation of the Bible for hundreds of years. But never mind that. What's important for our purposes is that James I ushers in this new dynasty of British kings, the Stuart dynasty, and it is quite the story. So after James I manages to keep everything relatively under control, his son Charles I, who is a pompous ass and who absolutely does not understand the powder keg he's sitting on, starts messing everything up and starts being openly Catholic, and people are freaking out about it. And finally, Parliament declares war on him. Like, the British have a giant civil war. The Parliament declares war on their own king, and they will fight in the British countryside for decades to come. Charles I is eventually captured, and Parliament is sitting around like, what the fuck do we do now? Like, we captured the. What do we do? Like, we've got a king. What do we do with the king? Like, we can't make him king. Are we ruling now? And then they finally decide to execute him. Like, they execute their own king. And then everything freaks out. The military like does a coup of the entire city, and Oliver Cromwell, the general at the time, just takes over and does what he wants. He manages to like die fairly peacefully, but they will get so mad at him that they will exhume the body and decapitate him posthumously, just to express how pissed they are at Cromwell taking over the city. Finally, like, Charles II will be reinstituted. He was like the long lost heir of Charles I, so he's ruling for a while and it's relatively tame. And then they get James II, who is kind of super Catholic again, and everyone freaks out again. And there's another revolution, but this one's shockingly bloodless. Instead, the British just go over to the Netherlands and they get William of Orange, and they're like, "Can you be our king now?" And William of Orange is like, "Don't you have a king?" And James II is like, "Yeah, I'm the king." And they're like, "Shut up and get out of our country!" So James II has to like flee in the night, and like he ends up taking a rowboat to Ireland, where he manages to get safe passage to France, where he will sulk and plot. But that, like, in the course of 50, 60 years, the British throw out their king twice. Two major deal revolutions. Now, part of this is because the British see their royalty as being foppish and out of touch with all of the sort of developments in the people, like because of this Protestant Catholic fight, because of this noble versus poor divide. Like, there are all of these problems here. So these lords are depicted frequently in British culture as being just stupid and out of touch. And notice how, like, the posture here just makes him look like you want to punch him in the face. Like, the British actually aren't producing many visual artists at this point in time. They have a lot of writers. We'll talk about quite a few of them, especially Milton in the days to come. But notice, like, they don't have a whole lot of artists. They keep importing them from the Netherlands, who they have a really good relationship with. And Van Dyck, like, can't even make this serious. Like, look at these assholes. Why would anyone listen to these jerks? So part of it is that disconnect. Part of it is also that the British have had a fairly long history of, like, treating their nobles like crap. The Magna Carta, centuries ago at this point, was basically a declaration that the king only ruled at the behest of the people. Though that has sort of been enforced irregularly over the decades and centuries since, now, it is a pretty decent justification for kicking out the king that everybody disagrees with. So this revolutionary spirit very much defines England in the 17th century. Like, it is just chaos after chaos after chaos. And ideologically, there are a lot of philosophers who are willing to come out of the woodwork and say, yeah, we are justified. Notably, Hobbs and Lock. Now, these are probably the guys that you remember from your, like, history textbooks on American history from high school and company. These are very much the sort of first thinkers interested in this idea that the government, should be by the people. Now, a lot of these ideas come from, Hobbes on the one hand stressing that, like, government only exists because, like, people are constantly fighting each other and they want to protect their property from the other people who are threatening it. Locke, on the other hand, after this glorious revolution of 1688, when, like, William of Orange just kind of takes over without a fight and James II goes crying off to his mommy, Locke publishes these essays, the two treatises of government especially, in which he basically says, yeah, we were perfectly justified. If the people are dissatisfied with their ruler, well, the ruler only rules on the people's behalf, and therefore the people are totally within their rights to just kick out whatever asshole is ticking them off and put some new asshole in their place. This will have consequences. The other text here, the essay concerning human understanding, is a more typical philosophical or modern philosophical work where Locke is sort of exploring the way that the mind works. And this is where he's going to talk about, like, everyone is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Like, we come into this world completely without assumptions, and we just have these assumptions sort of, like, imposed on us or built with us over time. Between these two ideas, Locke is building a picture of a world where people are the fundamental and most important unit of political significance. People and their rationality should be respected and should be considered the primary, like, political entities. Governments rule at the people's behalf, not the other way around. People will rule rationally and will rule in their own best interests, not some representative who has been sitting in a rich, fancy palace for all of their lives. Now, a lot of this actually springs from the fact that Europe has been changing radically during this time. Like we've talked about the sort of political movements and the way that each sort of nation refers to itself, but it's very much bigger than that. Europe in 1700, again, these nations are very much the clear political entities here. Unified England under the Stuarts, France under Louis XIV, not so much the Holy Roman Empire, which is still a giant freaking mess. But all of these nations are very much asserting themselves, coming to be. Hey, look, Prussia's getting bigger. I wonder if that'll have any consequences. And at the same time, the thing that we haven't talked about is how much reason has played a part of this. See, in the process of this 17th century, we've also seen this radical explosion of scientific inquiry, scientific exploration. The 17th century is often referred to as the scientific revolution. And depending on, who's the historian you're talking to, this could date back to, Galileo and Copernicus in the 16th century. It almost certainly reaches its peak with Sir Isaac Newton in the late 17th century. But what this is usually described as is the development of the scientific method as a method. We didn't talk about it too terribly much. It's something I go over in my philosophy classes all the time, but science didn't really exist as a separate discipline in the 17th century or any time before this. Philosophy was just the love of knowledge. Like the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers were just people who were interested in the world. And while Aristotle did a lot of science, or what we would call science today, he did it under the mantle of philosophy. And, even Sir Isaac Newton refers to his inquiries, his, Principia Mathematica, as natural philosophy, philosophy of nature. But in addition to all of this crazy political stuff, between Galileo's interest in data and Francis Bacon's interest in experimentation and Descartes' recognition of the limits of personal experience, this new way of getting information is being created, as the Crash Course video stressed. This is the birth of science as we know it. This is the idea that we should, look at knowledge and evaluate truth not based on what Plato and Aristotle told us, not what the Catholic Church tells us, not what the Bible tells us, but instead based on what our experience tells us, what experimentation tells us, what does the data tell us. And this explodes over Europe during this 100-year period. So you can see this is kind of a great map. I hope it's I hope you were looking at it big enough to be able to appreciate it. But all these little sunspots, these are all palaces modeled after Versailles. Again, Versailles catches on. Every noble wants a Versailles. Every king wants to centralize their power the way that the king in France has. And you'll notice there's 6 of them in the Holy Roman Empire because all those petty little kings and stuff are oh, I want to be an awesome king too, even though they clearly don't. But you can also see these blue things. These are all important universities. You've got tons of them in England, especially, as well as cropping up in France and in the Holy Roman Empire. You can see these big brown circles are other academic centers, other places where learning is emphasized, usually surrounding a monastery, because the monasteries were historically places where major academic engagement was taking place. And you can also see these little books or scientific journals. These are new publications, just like in the Renaissance. Now that we've got the printing press, we can just churn out our ideas and send them all over Europe. We can exchange information over long distances because there are all these more reliable technologies in place. And also observatories. That's what the microscopes are. People are looking at the stars the way that Galileo and Copernicus did. They're coming to their own conclusions about astronomy. And as a consequence, this is a time of great development. A bunch of people sort of looking at their world and trying to figure out how it works outside of the bounds that philosophy and religion and alchemy and other systems have frequently described. Science is frequently running rampant here. But the other side of this, especially in the 18th century, is we are starting to solve new problems with science. If science can give us fancy new telescopes and can give us fancy new like timepieces, like there's a famous awesome clock in Versailles, especially that like tracks the movement of the planets and the stars and like will apparently be accurate for like centuries after it was created. If we can solve those problems with science, well, why can't we solve other problems with science too? So this is the movement that is frequently called the Enlightenment. This moment when all of Europe decided it was going to trust science to solve their problems for them. Not just the technological problems, not just, questions about the universe, but also moral questions. Just as Locke is saying, hey, we're the people, we get to throw out kings if we want to, people are saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's solve all of our political problems with science. Let's use rationality to fix the problems with being a human being. Now, this is tricky, and there will definitely be problems with it down the road. We will talk about that in the lectures to come. But there are a lot of philosophers caught up in this idea, notably Rousseau. There are tons of French philosophers working during this period, famously known as the philosophes, guys like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Diderot. But Rousseau especially stands out because he was especially influential to the idea of democracy as it's kind of developing and as it will ultimately come to a head in the American Revolution, which we'll get to. Rousseau was, shockingly, a French thinker. Paris was very much the center of the Enlightenment at this moment in time. And he wrote his own confessions, sort of emphasizing his own personal experience, which is a fairly new development. Like, he's actually referring to Augustine's confessions of, over 1,200 years ago at this point in time. But Rousseau is sort of emphasizing that individual experience should guide one's search for knowledge, just like Descartes did, just like all of these scientists tend to emphasize. But Rousseau is also coming to this conclusion that the government should be perceived as a social contract. This idea that we all agree to have someone lead us, and that the people who do lead us are only there because of this social contract. He's taking Locke's argument about popular sovereignty to the next level. He is saying that is the only thing that decides where power is located. And as a consequence, we can absolutely overturn whatever rulers we don't like. But the other thing that very much characterizes this moment in sort of ideological history, this moment in Europe sort of investigating its own principles, is that these tend to be very utopian works. The idea in the Enlightenment is that if we apply scientific reasoning, scientific principles to human problems like government, we will ultimately come up with a solution the same way that we have come up with a solution to, how does light work, or how do the planets move, or anything like that. And by solution, we mean utopia. Kant goes so far as to insist in his essay, A Universal History Towards a Cosmopolitan Intent, and his other Perpetual Peace, that utopia is inevitable, that we are watching history push forward to this inevitable conclusion of peace and prosperity and tranquility, ushered in by this new scientific understanding of human nature and this sort of scientific conquest of human nature. This idea that we can be perfected if we apply our rationality, if we apply scientific principles, if we, just do enough philosophy and science, we can fix ourselves. We can make the world good. Now, the two works that I'm depicting here are the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of pure reason, which I unfortunately do not have enough time to spend a lot of time on. But Kant's whole approach is that rationality can solve the world. Just as in scientific circles, we frequently talk about this idea of a unified theory, this sort of answer to everything. Kant was proposing that this was not only possible, it was within reach. If we just pushed a little harder, we'd get it. And his critique of pure reason is very much aspiring to that. He is solving the problems of human rationality. He is saying that, the human mental apparatus is designed to solve problems, and that there is no problem that is out of our reach. There are some questions that we can't answer, but they are not important to our understanding of the world. In the process of all of this Enlightenment thinking, this new sort of prioritization on human accomplishment, and this sort of cult of reason, so to speak, new art movements are developing as well. But these art movements, you'll notice, are sort of focusing to two very diverse points. Just as we talked about in the florid Baroque, we have this sort of like opulence, the celebration of the aristocracy, the celebration of extreme wealth. The Rococo is very much an art movement designed to do the same thing. And you can see a lot of the elements of the florid Baroque here on display. The religious iconography is almost gone. Like, you can see a couple of angels up here, but they're definitely more like cutesy pagan angels than actual, like, glorified humanity angels. But notice also all of the detail here, all the filigree work, all of the ornate design, the fact that, like, nothing is straight without a bunch of, like, fiddly curlicues and stuff, that even the chandelier is just opulent and complicated. This is very typical of the Rococo. The Rococo is all about celebrating wealth, celebrating that, old European bloodlines and old European accomplishments. And this is absolutely the art style that is going to be adopted by all of those major old school kings, like Louis the 15th and 16th as they're coming down the pike. You will see building after building just lavishly decorated with this stuff. And you can see, like, all of this work and all of the, even like the fancy ivy design on the pillar and all of the, like, there's no space that is not busy with all of this detail, almost like the Gothic cathedrals, but where those pointed all up. They were all unified and like, let's look at God. The Rococo is all over the place. It is sensual and it is like engrossing. And you can see that, again, like, this is something that has existed even to this point. Like, look at the fancy party hall that this ultimately becomes when all the lights are on and when you fill it up with a bunch of people and instruments and stuff. Now, on the sort of, like, visual art side rather than the architectural details, you will notice that Rococo is all about sex. Like, if this is the, art form that most demonstrates the virtues of the nobility, the virtues of the aristocracy, the wealth and the sort of, like, excess of the aristocracy, you will see that a lot of effort is paid to sexuality and also to sort of, like, the ambiguity of the situation. So this is Pilgrimage to Cythera by Watteau in the 18th century. And notice how, at this point, like, all of the greenery, all of the landscaping has kind of been reduced to impression. Like, it's not impressionism yet, we'll get there. But notice that, like, over the course of the Baroque, it has gotten progressively more and more abstract. Like, remember Da Vinci and his, like, fastidious detail? Like, he knew every single plant that he was incorporating into his work. Here, the trees are just sort of vague. Like, you got these branches, but, like, the leaves aren't individually rendered. They're just sort of like lines and dots and stuff. You go into the background, it's all misty and foggy and more like an impression of the scene than actually the scene itself. It's more a sensation than it is a depiction. It's not realistic. It's meant to evoke an emotion only. Which is kind of fitting, because Cythera is the island where Aphrodite hangs out, and the pilgrimage to Cythera is let's all go have sex. And you can notice that some of these nobles are already, like, getting busy. But notice also, like, how ritzy all of these people are. The big staves and the fancy 18th century dress. This is a very modern group of people in a very old school classical pagan setting. And it is all about the anticipation of that sexual fulfillment. And you can see, like, the little cherubs, the little, Eros and company, lifting people up and carrying them off to Cythera, where they're going to hang out and have a good time. Now, in actuality, Eros is right here. Like, he's just chilling. He's sitting watching these people all, make out and stuff. And he's even put his bow aside because he doesn't need it anymore. Everybody's already so horny, he doesn't need to work at this. The Rococo is not ambiguous about its sexuality. So notice, Boucher is just willing to drop a naked lady onto his painting and be like, yep, it's naked lady. It's not a fancy naked lady. It's not a, like, important naked lady. It's not, religious naked lady. It's just naked lady, because naked ladies are pretty, and I like naked ladies. That's all the Rococo is frequently about. Like, it is very much just, here, folks, it's sex, because sex is awesome. And we don't need to be ashamed of it anymore, because screw the Catholic Church and screw, Christianity and Romanticism. It's the age of reason, baby. Reason tells us we's folks doing sex, so let's do us some sex, shall we? So here on the left, we have our pursuit by Fragonard, and you see this guy jumping out of the bushes with his flower, like, hey, baby, you want to go spend the afternoon with me or something? She's like, oh, no, what could you possibly have intentions upon me? Absolutely, let's go. Like, it's all interested in these sorts of fancy aristocratic pairings, these people sort of getting together and hooking up, because that's what the aristocracy is all about. They can afford this sort of lascivious behavior. They can, engage in these intrigues and these sexual plots. So the Rococo will absolutely emphasize sexuality over everything else. That is as close to morality as the Rococo would like to point out. Which, notice how much of a deviation that is from what the Renaissance was saying, what the Humanists were saying, even what the Baroque was saying. Where the Baroque was all about the power structure, the Rococo is an expression of that power structure. It's the power structure saying, we don't have to give a shit anymore. We make our paintings for ourselves, and what I want to see is naked ladies on a couch. So what's the big deal here? But there's reaction to this. This sort of classist divide is going to become more and more pronounced over the next 100 years, and we will talk about where that will end up. The immediate reaction is to sort of reject these aristocratic Rococo-type values. So here we have Marriage a la Mode, The Countess's Levee by Hogarth. And this you might mistake for Rococo. Here we have all these fancy people, all dressed up in fancy 18th century dress. But notice how ridiculous they are by contrast. Notice that, like, the guy who's singing from the choral book, he's got like this huge nose and he just looks really awkward with his mouth open like that. And there's like this guy whose hair is in curlers because, we're just all getting ready for parties and stuff. And like we got the lady over here and she's getting her hair done. But notice that like this guy is clearly passing notes to her and she's way more interested in him than, her husband. And we got more of this sort of sexualization over here. And notice, like, I should definitely emphasize that we have got a couple, like, black servants and stuff. This was fairly typical in the 18th century. Black slavery was very prevalent all over the place. And many of them are, like, imported from Africa or, this guy, we sort of assume that he's coming from the Ottoman Empire or Turkey or something. Orientalism is also a big deal here. But notice that they're actually, like, the moral centers of the piece. They aren't engaged in all this stupid aristocratic nonsense. And this kid over here, notice how he's pointing to the antlers on the deer thingy? That's an implication that he's talking about, like, cuckolding. A man who is horned is someone who his wife has been cheating on him, and the kid is definitely suggesting that like this business over here is some major deal cuckolding, and this guy is completely oblivious, sipping his coffee and like being very effeminate. This is a British painting, a condemnation of aristocratic Rococo values. Because in England, it's a very different attitude over there. Now that it's the people who decide who the government is, and not the government who just does what they want, and fuck all those, poor people with their stupid nonsense. See, in England, we've invented a whole new art form, the novel. And I know that this is going to come as a bit of a shock, but the novel is popular art. Like, I know that nobody wants to read books anymore in our culture, that the novel is kind of like for highfalutin, artsy people, and the only people who write them are like insular, self-gazing, masturbatory writers. But here we are in the 18th century, and virtually everyone with disposable income can read in England. Remember? We did the printing press. It exploded the number of books out there. People have been increasing in literacy by leaps and bounds. In England at this point, we're talking about like 50% plus literacy rate. There's a whole middle class who can't really afford to have, their own opera or, to commission a painting, but they can totally afford paper now that it's much cheaper than it used to be. And there are all these book binderies that are printing books out really, really cheaply, faster than ever before. Well, what if we, make books that are just exciting and popular and, fun? Enter Daniel Defoe, who is the great 18th century novelist in England and possibly considered the first novelist ever to write novels, anyway, where novel is a fairly carefully limited thing. Like Milton and Gulliver's Travels are not novels, or like an epic poem and travelogue, respectively. This is the first time that you can just tell a story in prose without all the highfalutin pretensions to art, no versification, no sort of verisimilitude. It's just like, hey, here's a story about this dude who got stranded on an island, and he has to survive in the wilderness, and that's considered the first novel ever written. A novel designed to just appeal to people, like normal people, not crazy rich people, not like crazy, religious people, but just like people. Robinson Crusoe has an exciting life, and his exciting life is recorded in this exciting story, and you can buy your copy of this exciting story for much cheaper than any other work of art ever produced up until this point. Defoe also publishes The Fortunes and Misfortunes of Moll Flanders, who is this woman she is relatively poor and she has a real bad time of it. Some of that is her own darn fault, but some of it is just her situation. And Moll Flanders is just normal folks. Defoe is writing a story with normal people, normal poor people in mind. And this stuff takes off. People buy these books by the thousands. It turns out to be a surprisingly lucrative endeavor. Apparently, you can make money by selling art to poor people as long as the art is cheap enough and popular enough that everybody wants it. Go figure. Here it is, folks, the very beginning of mass culture. The very beginning of an actual, dedicated top to bottom artistic enterprise. And this develops rather dramatically over the 18th century. All of these new popular novels are written, all of the novel as an art form just grows and blossoms. The one that I want to talk about is Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, because it's amazing. And it perfectly exemplifies this, because Tom Jones is all about how ridiculous everybody is. It is sort of quasi-structured as an epic poem, like the adventures of Tom Jones, the epic story of him just being an orphan and sort of trying to get along in lower to middle class English society, but it is presented as though it's this big, important, exciting adventure. There's a great scene where this one woman is beating her husband, and Fielding lapses into epic Homeric prose, like it's Achilles destroying Hector or something. It's absolutely amazing. But notice that this naturally appeals to the British public. On the one hand, it embodies these sort of highfalutin aristocratic ideals that they aspire to, while also ridiculing them. The rich people are silly and stupid, and therefore it's okay for you to be poor and middle class. That's actually probably better. See, notice that there is this whole sort of reactionary movement against the Rococo and their excesses. There is now this movement towards democracy, towards a popular artistic movement. And this very much grows to become the neoclassical art movement. So this is the Kenwood House, and this is our first American work of art. The Kenwood House is by Robert Adam. I forget exactly where in America it is. But notice, this is a return to old school Renaissance values. We got our barrel vaults, we got our simple columns, we got our pastel colors, we got our, everything that defines the Renaissance art movement. But notice that the colors are different and the materials are different. We got our carpeting, still simple, but not the tile floors that we're used to from the Renaissance. Instead of the walls being pale white or off-white, now we've got this pale blue thing going on. It is stately, but it is also measured. It lacks the, over-the-top bigness of the Renaissance art we saw from, the popes and Michelangelo and company. See, Neoclassicism is perhaps the first big art movement of the middle class. People who are not ostentatiously wealthy or important, people who just want a nice place to live and want, to use the old traditions and the old art forms to accomplish it. Neoclassicism, like classical Baroque, tends to emphasize the old classical traditions and classical subjects. So this is the Oath of the Horatii by David in the 18th century. And you'll notice here we have a lot of typical Renaissance characteristics. We have those poses. We have this sort of eternality hanging over the scene. We have all these classical figures in like their classical ancient Roman armor and, everything about this screams Renaissance, except you've got all this chiaroscuro darkness, sort of, especially in the background. It doesn't have that even lighting. And you'll notice this is a moment on the precipice of violence. As much as this is an eternal moment, like this is one of the most important scenes in ancient Roman history, the Oath of the Horatii is, they're going to go off and they're going to fight the enemy and they're going to bring back their women and they're going to like sort of set the groundwork for the coming Republic of Rome. And everyone is, of course, crying and upset because it could be that they're not coming back. As much as this is this important eternal moment, it's also, again, one of those moments on the verge of violence, much like we saw in a lot of the Baroque art and even some of the Mannerist art. And notice, like, even the swords here, they emphasize that things are about to get violent. Things are about to get ugly. Likewise, here is The Death of Socrates by David. And once again, a lot of typical Renaissance stuff. You have the poses that are very different. All the anguish and the upset seems to be much more in line with the Mannerist or Baroque sensibilities. You have the vault, but now you have linear perspective instead, pointing us to the back of the painting instead of to the front, to the sort of central position of Socrates taking the cup. But also, this is Socrates getting ready to die. Once again, we have this moment on the verge of violence. Socrates famously was condemned by the Athenian court for corrupting the youth of Athens, despite the fact that he was the greatest philosopher of the time, and he was executed by being forced to drink hemlock. Socrates is still teaching to the last. Notice his finger in the air. Oh, I'm making some important point like you'll find in the Phaedo. And everyone is weeping and wailing and upset, but he's ready to go. He's going to be dead in like 20 minutes. Just you wait. Neoclassicism seems preoccupied with this violence. As much as it is a middle-class art movement and a movement that is sort of meant to appeal to the regular people, to the popular sovereignty and the popular movements that are now sort of defining the world and defining political power, there's also this sort of assumption that they're only going to get it with upset, with violence. And perhaps that's nowhere more obvious than in America. See, American Neoclassicism is possibly one of the most obvious, and at least one of the most familiar, at least in this country, versions of Neoclassicism. So here you have Monticello, and yeah, Thomas Jefferson was absolutely a neoclassical architect in addition to all the other random crap that he did. All of his buildings, all the ones that he designed, are very much rooted in the neoclassical architecture form. And notice that, again, this is very Renaissance. You got the dome, you got the simple, straightforward facade, you got like the big triangles with the columns, like all of which you can see in a lot of Renaissance artwork, but it's all made out of brick because that's what they've got available. You don't have all that marble and fancy stuff hanging around in the new colonies. You certainly can't afford it. You make it a Renaissance work with whatever materials you have to hand. Now, Jefferson will also design the Virginia State Capitol building, and this should look very familiar because now we're getting closer and closer to sort of the architectural sensibilities we see in Washington, D.C. And again, this plain white exterior, you've got these plain white columns, very much those Renaissance ideals paired with American sensibilities and American limitations on material. And notice, this is itself a revolutionary expression. Like, obviously, I don't need to go into great detail about the fact that this is the verge of the American Revolution we're talking about. That, right after all of this, Enlightenment philosophy and stuff, the Americans are going to just chuck out the British after a long, protracted war that the British don't want to fight anymore. They're going to declare themselves independent, and they're basically going to frame it as, hey, we are the middle class, we are the poor people fighting against the rich people. We are the common run of humanity, kicking out the old aristocracy and building our own government based on those principles that Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Kant were also excited about. We are going to build utopia, in short. We are going to fix everything that is wrong with human suffering, and we are going to replace it with clear, simple rationality. We are going to break all of our old habits and we're going to make them new. This is very much the culmination of all of Enlightenment thought in some way. Like, I don't want to, underemphasize this, nor do I want to oversell it. But as far as the Founding Fathers are concerned, they were doing this. They were making the Enlightenment values happen. And from the perspective of Europe, that was exactly the same thing that they saw. This was an experiment. This was, can they do it? Can they build a society based on rationality, separate from all of the old power structures? Can they make something new and good out of that? And to some degree, they do. Like, it takes somehow, despite all of the suggestions to the contrary, despite all of the threats of coups and violence and, internal unrest, the Americans basically lay out a new government, they build a new constitution, and people buy it. It takes a while to get everybody on board. Like, don't get me wrong, the Articles of Confederation was a giant mess, and we've got quite a few rebellions hanging around. But by the end of the 18th century, the American experiment, the American project, is well underway, and Europe is looking over their shoulders, thinking, maybe this is the future. Maybe there is a possibility of utopia on Earth if we just kick out all of our, futzy, rococo, overindulgent kings and priests and so on, and build our own society out of it. However, that's not exactly how it breaks down, as we will talk about in the lectures to come. For next week, or for next lecture, or for whatever the next reading is, we're going to talk about exactly how this all plays out. So we're reading some Moliere, and we're going to read some Milton for the next couple lectures, and we will see exactly how these sort of different aristocratic and democratic influences start bumping into each other. And in the weeks ahead, we will move on from the Enlightenment and see exactly how this new revolutionary spirit, this new, poor versus rich, democratic versus aristocratic ideals play out in history. It should be a good time. Till then, enjoy your week. I hope all is well, and happy reading.